Hello, everyone. Great answers to the Chapter 7 discussion question. I'd like to walk you through my thought process. So, in this little scenario, we had a woman who had experienced a car accident and was talking about some distress that she was experiencing in the wake of that car accident. Very clearly, we see that she is reporting personal distress, that she talks about multiple experiences of freaking out, particularly when in situations when she's reminded of the accident, such as when she's in a car. She also demonstrated visible signs of distress, crying, breathing heavily, being easily startled by the slamming of the door. Her behavior violates social norms. We see that those experiences of distress. First of all, we wouldn't say are just commonplace for the everyday person. And furthermore, she described how she relies so heavily on her husband to take her places due to fear of re-experiencing an accident um, and seeing it all over again. And lastly, we see that there is dysfunction in her social relationships. Her distress, her fear, her anxiety, and her avoidance behavior have caused some difficulties in her marriage with her husband. That she often yells at her husband and feels that he does not understand what she's going through. So this very clearly meets the criteria for a psychological disorder. And then it's a question of which disorder provides the best explanation for her symptoms. And we see that the most likely explanation is post traumatic stress disorder. If we look at the DSM 5 and look at some of the chapters that we talked about so far, we've talked a little bit about mood disorders, bipolar disorder, depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive and related disorders, as well as trauma and stress related disorders. Um, uh, these this set of disorders, all of these kind of go together. They're kind of the depression and anxiety kind of spectrum types of disorders, particularly when we think about OCD and the other related disorders, as well as trauma and stress related disorders. All of these really kind of fall under the realm of anxiety, but we have these two newer ways of thinking about anxiety to contrast it specifically with, say, the woman we saw in chapter 6, uh, 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 who had agoraphobia. In her situation, she was afraid of any scenario that where she would be in a public place where she might not feel that she's able to escape, such as being on a plane or being in a car or those kinds of related scenarios. And that's kind of similar to what um, the woman in this week's video is experiencing. She's afraid of being in a car, but it's different in that it's specifically related to a traumatic event that has occurred to her. That this car accident that she experienced um, was the main cause of the onset of her symptoms. And so PTSD is something that we often hear about with military veterans. It's probably the stereotypical um, group that we hear it with, but it can come from a variety of traumatic situations, including um, domestic abuse, car accidents, concussions, traumatic brain injuries. There's a range of scenarios, of traumatic scenarios that could lead someone to experiencing PTSD. And she meets pretty much all of the basic criteria for PTSD. The things that are really unique to PTSD that we would look for are things like dissociative reactions, flashbacks, the person feeling like the traumatic event is happening again, and having strong reactions to any internal or external cues that resemble the initial traumatic event. Things like smells, like the eucalyptus smell that she remembered from the accident, that triggers a strong reaction in her. Or being in a car or driving at night, specific things that are related to the exact scenario of her initial experience with the traumatic event. Other things that we would look for are things like recurrent dreams. The examiner asked her about it, but she didn't quite answer because she was startled by the slamming of the door. And we see that a marked arousal, an exaggerated startle response, the long pause that she took afterwards. Those are all telltale signs of PTSD. The one thing that's missing here is the duration. The examiner did not ask explicitly for information about how long these symptoms have been going on, and some of you pointed that out in responses. Very, very, very keen eyes. So when uh, uh, we describe it as PTSD when the symptoms have been occurring for at least 1 month since the traumatic event. If it's been less than 1 month, then we would classify it as acute stress disorder. And so it's very possible for someone to experience a traumatic event and then go on and to be initially diagnosed with acute stress disorder, and if the symptoms persist, call it a post-traumatic stress disorder. And also acute stress disorder, we're talking about if the symptoms are occurring within 1 to 3 days after, or I should say 3 days to 1 month after the traumatic event. Not everyone who experiences a traumatic event will necessarily have acute stress disorder. You could go through something, and not everyone who has a car accident experiences this. You might be startled the day of the accident or the next day of the accident, but if it lasts like a week or a few more weeks, and that's when we would consider that person at risk. Also, we want to differentiate PTSD from not acute stress disorder. We want to differentiate it from things like specific phobia, just like we did with agoraphobia and specific phobia. If we look at the chapter on anxiety disorders and then go to specific phobia, and we'll go to the differential diagnosis section. Right. So we see here that if the phobia develops following a traumatic event, then we would consider it to be post-traumatic stress disorder. However, people who experience specific phobias can also be individuals who have experienced traumatic things happen to them or traumatic events, and so they're not necessarily. It's not necessarily one or the other. But for example, if the woman in this video was specifically just afraid of being in the car, and that was it, she was just afraid of being in a car, then we might consider that to be a specific phobia. If it was a fear of being in a car and in a plane and any form of public transportation, we might consider that to be agoraphobia. In this case, she's not only afraid of being in a car, but she's afraid of anything related to the accident. Being in a car, driving at night, smells related to the accident, the song that was playing on the radio. That cluster of symptoms suggests that this isn't just a specific phobia related to cars. This is a larger disorder in relation to a traumatic thing that she has been through. Great answers.